Hello, my name is Jeffrey Weiner, and I'm here to talk about enforcement of incidental take under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA. And specifically, I want to ask the question whether or not this enforcement has been effective in minimizing the wind turbine industry's impact on avian species. And in the foreground there, you see a picture of Duke Energy's top-of-the-world wind farm, which is uniquely positioned to help answer this question. But first, by way of landscape, let's acknowledge that there are many protections in place for avian species. Endangered Species Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, or MPEG4, as well as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And we're going to focus on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that there is a criminal side of this particular act that makes it uniquely interesting for the wind farms in the past few years. So we want to focus on the MBTA and not the other regulations out there. We want to focus on enforcement only. We don't want to investigate necessarily the regulatory scheme or legislation that's out there. We want to see how the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular has forced or facilitated enforcement on wind farms. But by way of definition, we should talk about take, which is an umbrella term that includes, among other things, human actions that kill wildlife. Incidental take is a type of take that's resulting from an activity, but is not the purpose of the activity. So, for example, a hunter goes out and does a take. That's a take. That's what they were there for. A wind turbine, on the other hand, is just creating electricity, and an eagle might come in contact with the turbines, and that is an incidental take because the turbines weren't there to kill birds, it was there to generate electricity. We want to talk about enforcement against wind energy owners and operators only. Most of the enforcement actions on incidental take are focused on the oil and gas industry and other industries back as far as the 70s. This type of action against wind operators is a very recent development that I think is very novel to investigate. So let's talk about the enforcement of incidental take in the MBTA. Where do the courts stand? Well, they're split, almost right down the middle, holding that MBTA criminalizes incidental take are the Court of Appeals in the 2nd and, not surprisingly, Coal Country in the 10th Circuit. District courts in the 9th and the Districts of Columbia as well. But, however, the MBTA being held does not prohibit or criminalize incidental take as the Court of Appeals in the 5th, 8th, and 9th District, as well as the district courts in the 3rd and the 7th. So there's a very widespread here, and it's feeding, at least initially, the regulatory uncertainty on if I build a wind farm, is it or is it not? It depends. And you'll see as we get through this that the regulatory uncertainty has grown rather than shrunk. So it was only recently that U.S. Fish and Wildlife was pushing for a conviction under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And the first one to plead guilty was Duke Energy in 2013 in connection with some of the projects in Wyoming, top of the world being one of them. Under the plea agreement, the company was to pay fines and restitution totaling $2 million and was placed on probation for 5 years. Part of that probation was to put in place an environmental compliance plan set to prevent bird deaths at its Wyoming projects. Also, the company was required to apply for an eagle take permit under MPEG4. Just a year later, PacifiCorp then pleaded guilty as well, substantially the same terms of the plea agreement, but this time a $2 million fine. But in addition to the criminal enforcement activity, is a civil option as well for enforcement. And 3 companies, so far as I've been able to find, were a part of that: EDF, Avangrid, and Pattern. And again, these companies undertook, as well as Duke Energy and PacifiCorp, voluntary actions trying to be above board and transparent with their operations. And as a part of those voluntary aspects, brought in environmental scientists to do avian surveys, post-construction surveys, efficiency tests, and reported those results to the agency. So one could argue, if it was meant that the folks that undertook voluntary efforts perhaps should have been the one to be subject of criminal and civil enforcement. But here on the civil side, the amount was between $10,000 and $25,000 per take that was reported. And then, similar to PacifiCorp and Duke Energy, they were required to invest in avian detection and deterrent technologies for a dollar amount between $250,000 and $1 million, depending upon the actor. So what was the result? Well, here's an example of what Duke Energy did. I'm somewhat familiar with that company, and at the bottom there you see a tower next to a turbine. So their first phase, the state of the art, was to take environmental scientists like you see in the right side there, and give them a pair of binoculars and sit them in that tower from dusk till dawn, especially in migratory season, and watch for birds. And if they see an eagle flying around one of the turbines, they have a big red button. Indeed, they have dozens of big red buttons, one per turbine. And they see a bird flying or aiming towards one of these turbines, they will punch the button, stop the turbine, and wait for that bird to fly away, in which case they will restart that turbine. Well, clearly it does not seem like a very sophisticated method of operation. Indeed, it wasn't, and one could argue how efficient it was. But there wasn't a lot. This is the state of the art, even today. There's only two other companies that I'm aware of, PacifiCorp, not surprisingly, but they don't have as much eagle activity as Duke Energy, as well as Pattern. However, Pattern's tower was put up as a part of a requirement to build their turbine on public lands. So this was Duke Energy's initial effort. And but nonetheless, as a part of the consent decree, us and others were required to continue funding research into something next. And that's what they did. Duke Energy put research into military-grade radar, and we found that military-grade radar was great at identifying trucks down the road, but not so great at flying eagles around a turbine. We looked at putting lights on the turbine and sounds on the turbine and lasers on the turbine to distract and confuse the birds. Well, it turns out birds are apparently quite happy to fly in discos. They're alpha predators, so they don't care. So eventually we stumbled upon what seems to work, and is called Identiflight. There's a Pattern and a few others have looked at DT Bird, which is a similar type technology, but I'm not as familiar with those. But Identiflight, I describe it as facial recognition software on steroids. So as you see there, you have a camera pointed at a turbine, and that camera keeps an eye out for eagles. And in fact, it can tell not only if there's a bird, but what the species of the bird is, as well as if it's old or if it's young. And if it's one of the listed birds, it will stop the turbine. It will wait for the eagle or the listed bird to get out of the area. And it's sophisticated algorithms can figure out, is it flying towards the turbine, away from the turbine, up, down, whatever it is. But there was a pilot test, seemed to do very well, and Duke Energy is now rolling out this technology on half of the wind farm to see what a full-scale operation would look like. So again, I pondered earlier about whether or not it would be appropriate to fine or put enforcement actions against companies that were undertaking voluntary efforts. But nonetheless, but for the enforcement activities, we wouldn't have this type of what is now a commercially viable product. And that's a good thing. But there's also some surprising enforcement circumstances that have occurred in the landscape as well. The Solicitor M opinion, which is essentially the Solicitor General's direction for what's going to be prosecuted, what's the point of focus areas of prosecution. It came out just in December, this past December, saying the MBTA does not prohibit incidental take, overturning a contrary opinion issued just 11 months earlier. So one might say that, well, since the administration isn't going to go after this, then it's all set. There is no regulatory uncertainty. Wind farms don't have to worry about this consideration. But that's just not the case, as we all know that there are other enforcement mechanisms, such as citizen suits, that are out there and are very much active. As you see, Sierra Club, which is just one of them, has said donations have increased 700% since the election. As well as the administration has swung one way, and there's quite an expectation that eventually other administrations might swing the other way. So based upon the totality, it feels to many operators that the uncertainty, the regulatory uncertainty, the enforcement uncertainty is more rather than less now. And so, there are some very large operators, much larger than the ones described to already in this presentation, that are lawyering up and waiting for a fight and want to actively engage controversy to win the battle, if you will. But there are others, a very powerful argument, I think, that says we shouldn't lose sight of this uncertainty and build bridges with environmental NGOs and try to find some sort of outcome on a partnership basis, be it permits or some other construct that would be sustainable in the long run. But to our question, has enforcement activities focusing on these things been effective in minimizing the wind turbine industry's impact on avian species? Well, to answer this definitively, you would have to look at the overall population of bird take before and after the enforcement actions. And that's impossible because it's just voluntary and not everyone is reporting them. However, one could use the proxy of the mitigating efforts that we've just described to see whether or not something has done. Well, in the absence of these activities, it was unlikely that the avian avoidance systems would have happened, and companies like Duke Energy and PacifiCorp just wouldn't have invested. So one could infer that these enforcement actions, circuitously did have a positive influence. And while far from minimizing the impact of wind turbines, it does provide a likely reduction in impacts, and certainly a platform to leverage in the future. Thank you very much, and that's my presentation.